Birth and early life. Rome, on a warm August day in the year 12 CE. A child was born into the most powerful empire the world had ever known. The air was thick with the scent of incense and olive oil, and within the grand chambers of a Roman villa, the cries of a newborn echoed through marble halls. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a name heavy with the weight of imperial destiny, a name that connected him to the greatest figures in Roman history. But history, with its peculiar sense of irony, would remember him by another name, entire Caligula, a nickname that meant little boots, given to him not in mockery, but in affection, by the hardened soldiers who would come to adore him. This child was born into privilege beyond imagination. His father was Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved and successful generals, a man whose military victories had expanded the empire's borders and whose charisma had won the hearts of both soldiers and citizens alike. Germanicus was the type of leader men would follow into the darkest forests of Germania, the kind of commander who inspired loyalty not through fear, but through genuine respect and admiration. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was no less remarkable. She was a woman of immense influence, a noblewoman whose lineage connected her directly to Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. She was intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely protective of her family. In her veins ran the blood of emperors, and she carried herself with the dignity and determination that such heritage demanded. Young Gaius grew up in a world of military camps and imperial grandeur, while other children of noble families were raised in the comfort of Roman villas, learning their letters and practicing oratory in peaceful gardens. Gaius accompanied his father on military campaigns along the Rhine frontier. Can you imagine it? A small boy, no more than 2 or 3 years old, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny military boots Caligulae, from which his nickname derived. The soldiers of the Rhine legions, those tough, battle-hardened men who had seen the worst that war could offer, melted at the sight of this child marching among them in his little costume. They called him Caligula Little Boots, and the name stuck with a warmth and affection that spoke volumes about how they saw him. To them, he represented hope, innocence, and the future of Rome itself. When they looked at this boy, they didn't just see the son of their beloved commander. They saw the heir to an empire that stretched from the wild, fog-shrouded forests of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the rocky coasts of Hispania to the ancient cities of the East. In his small face, they saw Rome's tomorrow, and they loved him for it. The military camps were Gaius's playground and his school. While other children learned about war from books and tutors, he learned from direct observation. He watched his father plan campaigns, saw how Germanicus treated his soldiers with respect and fairness, observed the discipline and order that made the Roman legions the most formidable fighting force the world had ever known. He heard the songs the soldiers sang around their campfires, learned their rough humor, and absorbed their values of loyalty, courage, and duty. These early experiences shaped him in ways that would echo throughout his life, for better and for worse. But even in these early years, there were shadows. The Roman court was a place of constant intrigue, where ambition and paranoia walked hand in hand through the corridors of power. Gaius's father, despite his popularity, or perhaps because of it, had enemies. The current emperor, Tiberius, was Germanicus's great-uncle, but their relationship was complicated, strained by jealousy and political maneuvering. Tiberius was a capable ruler, but a deeply suspicious one, and Germanicus's growing popularity among the people and the legions made him a potential threat, whether he intended to be one or not. Young Gaius was too small to understand the complex political games being played around him. He didn't comprehend the significance of the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, or the worried looks that passed between his parents when they thought the children weren't watching. He simply knew that his father was a hero, his mother was strong and beautiful, and he himself was loved by everyone he met. He knew the warmth of campfires and the pride of wearing his little uniform. He knew the feeling of being lifted onto his father's shoulders to watch a military parade, and the security of falling asleep in his mother's arms. While the camp settled into its nightly routines, his early childhood was filled with these moments of joy and security. He had brothers who played with him, sisters who doted on him. The family was close-knit, bound together by genuine affection, as well as by their shared prestigious lineage. Agrippina was a devoted mother who ensured her children received the best education available, even while following her husband on his military campaigns. She wanted them to be prepared for whatever roles destiny had in store for them, whether as military commanders, political leaders, or influential members of Roman society. For young Gaius, the future seemed limitless and bright. He was the son of Rome's greatest general, beloved by the legions, connected by blood to the imperial throne. The soldiers who affectionately called him Caligula spoke often of the great things he would one day accomplish. They imagined him leading legions to victory, as his father did, or perhaps even ascending to the purple, becoming emperor himself. Why not? He had the bloodline, the intelligence that was already evident even in childhood, and most importantly, the love of the people and the army. In Rome, these were the ingredients of power, but fate, the happiness and security of Gaius's early childhood, were built on foundations far more fragile than anyone realized. Political fortune in Rome could change as quickly as the weather, and the higher one's position, the farther one had to fall. The little boy in his miniature soldier's boots, marching proudly through the military camps of Germania, had no way of knowing that tragedy was already approaching, that the love and security he took for granted would soon be ripped away, leaving scars that would never fully heal. The soldiers who called him Caligula and predicted his glorious future were right. In one sense, he would indeed become one of Rome's most famous rulers. But the path that would take him there would be paved with loss, betrayal, and suffering that would fundamentally change who he was. The innocent, cheerful child beloved by the legions would be transformed by circumstances into something very different, something darker. But in these early years, none of that had happened yet. For now, he was simply Little Boots, the golden child of Rome's golden family, marching through military camps with his father's soldiers, secure in the love that surrounded him, blissfully unaware that everything was about to change. Family tragedy struck early and struck hard, shattering the idyllic world that young Gaius had known. In the year 19 CE, when Gaius was just 7 years old, his father Germanicus fell mysteriously ill while on campaign in the eastern provinces of the empire. What began as a fever quickly worsened into something far more sinister. Germanicus, the strong and vigorous general who had conquered Germania's tribes and won the adoration of Rome, was brought low by an illness that no physician seemed able to treat or even properly understand. The circumstances surrounding Germanicus's illness were suspicious from the very beginning. He himself believed he had been poisoned, and on his deathbed he reportedly told his wife Agrippina that he had been murdered. But by whom, and on whose orders? These questions would haunt the family and fuel conspiracy theories for generations to come. Many whispered that Emperor Tiberius, Germanicus's great-uncle and the current ruler of Rome, had orchestrated the poisoning. Tiberius had grown increasingly jealous of Germanicus's popularity, threatened by the way the people and the legions loved him far more than they loved their actual emperor. Whether these suspicions were true or not, history has never definitively answered this question. Died in agony in the city of Antioch, far from Rome, far from the military camps where his soldiers mourned him, far from his young children who would now have to grow up without their father's protection and guidance. His death sent shockwaves throughout the empire. The people of Rome wept openly in the streets. The legions, particularly those who had served under him, were devastated, and for the family he left behind, his death marked the beginning of a nightmare that would consume them all. Agrippina was not a woman who grieved quietly or accepted fate passively. She was convinced that her husband had been murdered, and she was determined that the world would know it. With fierce maternal instinct and political courage that many men lacked, she brought Germanicus's ashes back to Rome herself, carrying the urn through the streets while crowds of mourning citizens lined the route. It was a powerful, dramatic gesture that embarrassed Emperor Tiberius and painted him as a possible villain in the public imagination. Agrippina made no secret of her suspicions, and her open defiance of the emperor set her on a collision course with the most powerful man in the world. These experiences would shape everything that came after. They would inform his understanding of power, his relationships with others, and his eventual behavior as emperor. The trauma of watching his family destroyed while he remained powerless to help them created wounds that would never heal, paranoia that would only grow worse with time, and a fundamental understanding of the brutal realities that lay beneath Rome's civilized veneer. The innocent child called Little Boots by affectionate soldiers was being forged into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. But his ordeal was not yet over. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning, because Tiberius, having destroyed Gaius's family, now decided to take the boy under his own protection. Gaius was summoned to live with the emperor himself on the island of Capri, where Tiberius had retreated from Rome to live out his final years in increasing paranoia and debauchery. For young Gaius, this was not a rescue. It was simply the next chapter in a nightmare that had already consumed his childhood. He was going to live with the man who might have murdered his father, who had definitely persecuted his family, and who now held absolute power over whether Gaius lived or died. It was a blood-soaked childhood indeed, and its effects would echo through history in ways that no one could have predicted. Rise to power despite this blood-soaked childhood, despite the trauma and loss that would have broken many people, Caligula survived. His survival, however, came at a cost. It required him to become someone different, someone harder, someone capable of playing the deadliest game in the world. the game of imperial politics under one of Rome's most paranoid and unpredictable emperors. Gaius was sent to live under the watchful eye of Tiberius on the island of Capri when he was still a teenager. Capri, located in the Bay of Naples, was stunningly beautiful, a paradise of blue waters, dramatic cliffs, and lush vegetation. But for Gaius, it was less a paradise and more a gilded prison, a place where he had to watch every word, every gesture, every expression, knowing that his life depended on pleasing an increasingly unstable emperor who had already destroyed the rest of his family. Tiberius by this time had become a very different man from the capable general and administrator who had first taken the throne. Years of ruling had worn him down, made him suspicious of everyone, convinced him that plots and conspiracies lurked around every corner. He had retreated to Capri in part to escape the political pressures of Rome, but he had brought his paranoia with him. The island became a strange world of contradictions, a place of incredible beauty and terrible darkness, where the emperor surrounded himself with astrologers, philosophers, and according to some accounts, engaged in behaviors that shocked even the jaded sensibilities of Rome's upper classes. Living on Capri was an education in the dark arts of survival and power. He learned to read the emperor's moods, to anticipate his desires, to present himself as completely loyal and unthreatening. This required extraordinary self-control for a young man who had every reason to hate Tiberius. Who must have suspected that this man sitting before him had orchestrated his father's murder and his family's destruction? But Gaius played the game perfectly. He never showed anger, never displayed resentment, never gave Tiberius any reason to see him as a threat. According to historical accounts, Gaius became quite skilled at hiding his true thoughts. He learned to wear masks, to perform whatever role the situation required. When Tiberius wanted a companion for his dinners, Gaius was charming and entertaining. When the emperor wanted someone to listen to his complaints and paranoid theories, Gaius was sympathetic and agreeable. When Tiberius was in one of his darker moods, Gaius knew when to be invisible, when to disappear into the background and not draw attention to himself. This was not the carefree life of a typical Roman aristocrat. While young men of his class in Rome were attending rhetorical schools, making political connections, beginning their careers in the military or the law, Gaius was trapped on an island, constantly performing, constantly aware that one mistake, one wrong word, one moment of letting his guard down could mean his death. He was, in effect, a prisoner who had to pretend to be a willing guest, and this psychological strain must have been immense. But he was also learning about power, how it worked, how it corrupted, how it could be maintained and exercised. He watched Tiberius rule from a distance, issuing orders that affected millions of people while never leaving his island retreat. He saw how fear could be used as a tool of control, how suspicion and accusations could destroy even the innocent, how absolute power freed a person from normal constraints of behavior and morality. He learned that in Rome, appearances mattered more than reality, that perception was power, and that the person who controlled the narrative controlled everything. Some historians have suggested that Gaius witnessed or even participated in the debaucheries that allegedly took place on Capri under Tiberius's rule. The ancient sources speak of orgies, cruelty, and perverse entertainments that shocked contemporary sensibilities. Whether these accounts are accurate or exaggerated propaganda is difficult to determine. Roman historians had a tendency to embellish the vices of unpopular emperors. But even if we discount the more lurid details, it's clear that Capri under Tiberius was not a healthy environment for a young man's moral and psychological development. Gaius was learning other things, too practical, things about administration, about the machinery of empire, about military matters and financial systems. Tiberius, despite his personal failings, was not an incompetent emperor. He maintained Rome's borders, kept the treasury full, and governed with a certain ruthless efficiency. Gaius had access to all of this, watching how an empire actually functioned, seeing the reports that came in from provinces across the known world, understanding the vast complexity of ruling millions of people spread across 3 continents. But most importantly, perhaps Gaius was learning patience. He was learning to wait for his moment, because despite everything, despite the trauma and the danger, he still had one tremendous advantage: his bloodline. He was still the son of Germanicus, still connected by blood to Augustus, the first emperor. And in Rome, bloodline mattered enormously. The people hadn't forgotten Germanicus. The legions still spoke of him with reverence. And while Tiberius had no legitimate son of his own, Gaius represented a continuation of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Whether Tiberius liked it or not, Gaius was a potential heir to the throne, and so he waited, year after year on Capri, maintaining his masks, playing his roles, hiding his thoughts and feelings so completely that even centuries later, historians would debate what he was really thinking during this period. Was he genuinely loyal to Tiberius, grateful for being allowed to live? Or was he silently plotting, nursing his grievances, waiting for the moment when the old emperor would finally die and he could claim what was rightfully his? In 37 CE, that moment finally arrived. Tiberius, now 77 years old and in failing health, died on March 16th. There are, predictably, different accounts of his death. Some say he died naturally, of old age and illness. Others suggest he was smothered with a pillow by one of his attendants, possibly with Gaius's knowledge, or even at his command. The truth, like so much else about this period, is lost to history. What matters is that Tiberius was dead, and Gaius was suddenly free. The news of Tiberius's death was greeted with an outpouring of joy in Rome. The old emperor had never been popular, and by the end of his reign, he was actively hated. People danced in the streets, threw his statues into the Tiber River, and called for his body to be dragged through the streets with hooks. It was an ugly display of how much fear and resentment his paranoid rule had generated. And into this atmosphere of relief and celebration came Gaius Young, handsome, the son of beloved Germanicus. Representing hope and renewal after the darkness of Tiberius's final years, Gaius was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard and confirmed by the Senate. At just 24 years old, he became Caligula, emperor of Rome, ruler of the most powerful empire the world had known, and the people rejoiced. They saw in him not just a new emperor, but a fresh start. They saw the son of Germanicus, the little boy in soldier's boots they remembered from stories, now grown into a man who would restore Rome to glory. They saw the end of Tiberius's oppressive reign and the beginning of something better. Gaius's ascension to power was met with an outpouring of enthusiasm that was rare in Roman politics. The people loved him before he had even done anything, simply because of who his father had been and because he represented hope and change. The Senate, always eager to please a new emperor, showered him with honors and titles. The army, still loyal to the memory of Germanicus, pledged their support enthusiastically. It seemed that the young man who had survived so much tragedy, who had endured years of watching every word and gesture on Capri, had finally reached safety. He was no longer powerless. He was no longer in danger. He was the most powerful person in the world. The early promise initial reign at first Caligula did not disappoint. In fact, his first several months as emperor seemed to confirm every hopeful expectation the Roman people had invested in him. It appeared that their faith in Jerusalem's son had been entirely justified, that Rome had indeed found a worthy leader who would usher in a new era of prosperity and justice. The young emperor, finally free from the oppressive atmosphere of Capri, seemed determined to show that he was nothing like the suspicious, cruel Tiberius who had ruled before him. One of Caligula's first acts as emperor was to grant a general amnesty to those who had been imprisoned or exiled under Tiberius's paranoid rule. The prisons of Rome, which had been filled with people accused of treason often on the flimsiest of evidence, were opened, and prisoners were allowed to return to their families. These were people who had lived for years in fear and darkness, some of them guilty of nothing more than being related to someone Tiberius suspected, or having said something that was reported out of context by an informer hoping to gain favor. Caligula's mercy brought them home, reunited families, and sent a powerful message that the reign of fear was over. He also ended the hated treason trials that had been a hallmark of Tiberius's later years. Under Tiberius, the charge of majestus treason against the state had been used ruthlessly to eliminate potential enemies and confiscate the property of the wealthy. Accusations were easy to make and nearly impossible to defend against, and the system had created an atmosphere of terror where no one felt safe, where a careless word at a dinner party could lead to arrest, torture, and execution. Caligula, publicly, declared that such trials would no longer be tolerated. He wanted Rome to be a place where citizens could speak freely without fear, where justice was real rather than a tool for political persecution. The young emperor also showed extraordinary generosity toward the Roman people. He lavished gifts upon them with a liberality that seemed to know no bounds. He understood instinctively that in Rome, public spectacle and generosity were essential tools for maintaining popular support, and he threw himself into providing both with remarkable enthusiasm. The games and spectacles he organized were unprecedented in their scale and magnificence. Gladiatorial contests, chariot races, theatrical performances, and exotic animal shows filled the calendar, giving the people of Rome constant entertainment and distraction. These weren't merely rehashes of old formulas either. Caligula brought creativity and innovation to public entertainment. He organized elaborate naval battles in flooded arenas, brought exotic animals from the farthest reaches of the empire, and commissioned new theatrical productions that pushed the boundaries of what Roman entertainment could be. The people loved it. For the first time in years, Rome felt like a place of joy and celebration rather than fear and suspicion. The markets were full. The festivals were grand, and the people believed that their new young emperor truly cared about their happiness. Caligula also demonstrated political intelligence in his early months. He treated the Senate with respect, consulting them on important matters and making them feel valued and essential to governance. This was a stark contrast to Tiberius, who had treated the Senate with barely concealed contempt in his later years, viewing them as a necessary nuisance rather than a partner in government. Caligula attended Senate meetings, listened to debates, and praised senators publicly. He seemed to understand that while he held ultimate power, maintaining good relations with the Senate made ruling easier and more effective. He also showed affection and loyalty to his family, something that resonated deeply with Roman values. He publicly honored his mother and father, having Agrippina and Germanicus deified and establishing festivals in their memory. This was both politically smart, as it reinforced his own legitimacy, and seemingly genuine, a way of honoring the parents he had lost so young. He brought his sisters back from exile or obscurity and gave them prominent roles in court life. He seemed to be building the kind of strong family unit that his own childhood had been denied, creating a dynasty that would ensure stability for Rome's future. The young emperor also demonstrated genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary Romans. He undertook building projects that weren't just about imperial grandeur, but about improving daily life. He worked on Rome's water supply system, ensuring clean water reached more neighborhoods. He improved the grain supply, which was essential for feeding Rome's massive population. He built new roads and repaired old ones, facilitating trade and communication throughout Italy. These were practical, unglamorous projects that made real differences in people's lives, and they were appreciated. Foreign relations also received his attention. He made diplomatic overtures to neighboring kingdoms, securing Rome's borders through treaties and alliances rather than expensive military campaigns. He understood that Rome's empire was already vast and that consolidation and good governance were more important than endless expansion. He received foreign ambassadors with appropriate ceremony, negotiated trade agreements, and generally presented Rome as a confident, prosperous power that was strong but not aggressively militaristic. For approximately 6 to 7 months, this continued. Rome had a young, energetic, generous emperor who seemed to embody everything people had hoped for. Caligula was handsome, charismatic, and genuinely popular. When he walked through Rome's streets, people cheered. When he attended the games, the crowd roared their approval. When he spoke in public, people listened with genuine enthusiasm. He seemed to have escaped the darkness of his upbringing, to have overcome the trauma of his family's destruction, and to have emerged as a leader who would guide Rome into a golden age. It seemed as though a golden age had truly begun. The city buzzed with optimism. Markets thrived as economic confidence returned. Artists and poets flourished under imperial patronage. The military was well paid and well supplied. The provinces sent their taxes without excessive complaint because they believed the money was being used wisely. Rome, after the oppressive final years of Tiberius, had rediscovered joy. And at the center of it all was the young emperor, the son of Germanicus, the boy who had been called Little Boots by soldiers who loved him, now grown into a man who seemed destined to fulfill all of Rome's highest hopes. But then something changed, something fundamental and terrible. What exactly happened remains one of history's enduring mysteries. But within the first year of his reign, Caligula suffered a severe illness. The exact nature of this illness is unknown. Ancient sources are frustratingly vague on the details. Some historians claim it was a fever, a devastating infection that brought him to the brink of death. Others suggest it might have been poisoning, an attempt on his life that failed to kill him but succeeded in damaging him in other ways. Still, others have speculated about epilepsy, encephalitis, or some other neurological condition that could have affected his brain and personality. For several days, or perhaps weeks, Rome held its breath as their young emperor fought for his life. The entire city prayed for his recovery. People made offerings at temples, begging the gods to spare him. The Senate suspended normal business, waiting for news from the palace. The fear was palpable. If Caligula died, who would replace him? Would there be civil war? Would the stability and joy of the past months dissolve into chaos and violence once again? But Caligula did not die. He recovered, emerged from his sick room, and resumed his duties. Rome rejoiced. Their emperor had been spared. But something was wrong. Something had changed. The man who emerged from that illness was not quite the same person who had fallen ill. The transformation was subtle at first, perhaps not immediately obvious to everyone. But those who knew him best, who worked closely with him, began to notice differences in his behavior, his judgment, his personality. The charming young emperor who had won Rome's heart had vanished, replaced by something far more troubling and dangerous. Whatever happened during that illness, whether it was the disease itself, the treatments used to combat it, or simply the psychological stress of nearly dying, it marked a turning point. The golden age that had seemed so promising was about to transform into something very different, something dark and terrifying that would shock Rome to its core and ensure that the name Caligula would echo through history, not as a beloved leader, but as a warning about the dangers of absolute power in the hands of someone whose sanity had been shattered. The descent into madness, what followed. Caligula's mysterious illness was one of the most infamous reigns in the entire history of the Roman Empire. The young man who had been Rome's hope transformed into Rome's nightmare, embarking on a course of behavior so bizarre, so cruel, and so divorced from rational governance that it shocked even a society that had seen its share of difficult emperors. The transformation was gradual enough that at first people made excuses, tried to rationalize what they were seeing, hoped that their emperor would return to his earlier wisdom. But as time passed, it became impossible to deny that something fundamental had broken in Caligula's mind, or soul, or both. Caligula's rule became a spectacle of extravagance that went far beyond what even Rome, a city accustomed to imperial excess, considered reasonable or appropriate. He began to drain the empire's treasury, the same treasury that Tiberius had carefully maintained and that Caligula had inherited in excellent condition. Projects and expenditures that served no purpose except his own pleasure and glorification. He commissioned the construction of lavish palaces that were marvels of engineering and artistic achievement, but completely unnecessary and ruinously expensive. He held parties that were legendary for their opulence, where exotic foods from every corner of the empire were served on gold plates, where the entertainment cost more than many Roman citizens would earn in their entire lifetimes. These weren't occasional celebrations to mark important events or to maintain public morale. These were constant, ongoing displays of wealth being consumed for no reason other than because Caligula could, because he wanted to, because there was no one with the power to tell him no. Ships were commissioned and then destroyed after a single use. Precious gems were ground into powder to be scattered on floors. Food was prepared in such quantities that most of it went to waste. The spending was not just excessive, it was pathological. A kind of deliberate destruction of wealth that seemed designed to prove that resources meant nothing, that consequences didn't matter, that an emperor could do absolutely anything he wished. But the financial excess was only one aspect of Caligula's transformation. More troubling still was his growing megalomania, his conviction that he was not merely Rome's political leader, but actually divine. He began to proclaim himself a god, not in the metaphorical sense that emperors were sometimes deified after death, but literally, insisting that he was Jupiter incarnate, walking among mortals. He demanded to be worshipped as such, requiring citizens and senators alike to make offerings to him, to bow before his statues, to acknowledge his divinity with the same reverence they showed to the traditional gods of Rome. This was not merely offensive to Roman religious sensibilities. It was fundamentally destabilizing to the entire social and political order. Rome's system, even under the emperors, maintained the fiction that the ruler was a citizen who held power through the will of the Senate and people. By declaring himself an actual god, Caligula was stepping outside that system entirely, placing himself above all human institutions and accountability. He was saying, in effect, that normal rules didn't apply to him, that he was answerable to no one, that his will was the only law that mattered. Statues of himself were erected in temples across Rome and throughout the empire, often replacing or standing beside statues of the traditional gods. He insisted that priests make daily sacrifices to him. He allegedly ordered that the heads of famous statues of gods be removed and replaced with images of his own face, a sacrilege that horrified the genuinely religious and confirmed everyone's worst fears about his state of mind. Some temples were rededicated to his worship. He even considered having the great statue of Jupiter in the temple on the Capitoline Hill replaced with a statue of himself. His madness extended into his personal relationships. And this is where the cruelty that would define his reputation truly emerged. He began to delight in humiliation, in making the powerful and respected feel small and helpless. Senators, men who had held military commands, governed provinces, and represented Rome's most distinguished families were forced to grovel like slaves, to perform degrading tasks for the emperor's amusement. He would invite them to grand banquets and then mock them publicly, or serve them deliberately insulting amounts of food, or force them to watch as he seduced their wives. The humiliation was the point. He seemed to derive genuine pleasure from demonstrating his power by crushing the dignity of others. He reportedly replaced the heads of statues of gods with his own likeness throughout Rome, a blasphemous act that horrified the people who still believed in the traditional religion. But perhaps the most famous example of his bizarre behavior and contempt for Roman institutions was his relationship with his favorite horse, Incitatus. The horse was treated better than most humans in Rome. It had a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. Servants were assigned to care for it, and the horse apparently lived in luxury that would have been extraordinary even for a senator. But Caligula went further. He reportedly planned to appoint Incitatus as a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome, positions that were supposed to be held by the most distinguished men in the empire. Whether he actually intended to follow through with this plan, or whether it was a cruel joke meant to mock the Senate and show how little he valued their prestigious positions, remains debated by historians. But the fact that people believed he might actually do it speaks volumes about how far his behavior had deteriorated. It perfectly captured his disdain for tradition, for the institutions that had made Rome great, for the entire system of governance that had evolved over centuries. His cruelty knew no bounds. He ordered executions on a whim, sometimes simply because the idea amused him. The charge of treason, which he had promised to abolish when he first became emperor, returned with a vengeance, used now not to protect the state, but to satisfy personal grudges, or to confiscate the property of wealthy citizens, whose money Caligula wanted for his extravagant projects. Friends were executed for imagined insults. Allies who had supported his rise to power found themselves on the wrong side of his paranoia and paid with their lives. Even family members were not safe from his paranoia and cruelty. He had complex, troubling relationships with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, whom he seemed to love with an intensity that went beyond normal sibling affection. Some ancient sources claim their relationship was incestuous, though these accounts may be exaggerated or invented by hostile historians. What's certain is that when Drusilla died in 38 CE, Caligula's grief was excessive and public. He had her declared a goddess, required the entire empire to observe mourning, and made it a capital crime to laugh, bathe, or have dinner with one's family during the mourning period. His grief transformed into a weapon used against his subjects. Those who displeased him in any way were tortured, banished, or used as entertainment in the bloody arenas of Rome. Caligula reportedly enjoyed watching people die, attending executions and gladiatorial games with enthusiasm. Some accounts suggest he would order that executions be carried out slowly, so that the victims would feel themselves dying, demonstrating not just cruelty, but a kind of sadistic interest in suffering that went beyond even Rome's typically brutal standards. Perhaps the most bizarre manifestation of his madness was his obsession with the sea and his peculiar conflict with Neptune, the god of the sea. In what may have been genuine delusion, or perhaps a theatrical display of power, he ordered his legions to march to the shores of the English Channel and prepare for an invasion of Britain. The soldiers, confused but obedient, assembled on the beach, ready for battle. But instead of ordering them to board ships and cross to Britain, Caligula commanded them to declare war on Neptune himself, and to collect seashells as spoils of war. Rome watched in stunned disbelief as its powerful military legions, the same forces that had conquered nations and expanded the empire to unprecedented size, were reduced to picking up seashells on a beach while their emperor claimed victory over the ocean. Whether this was madness, mockery of his own military, or some bizarre symbolic gesture that made sense only to Caligula's deranged mind, it became one of the most enduring symbols of his completely irrational rule. The image of Roman soldiers, those disciplined warriors who had marched across continents and defeated mighty armies, bending down to pick up shells on a beach because their emperor commanded it. This image captured the absurdity and tragedy of Caligula's reign perfectly. The fall and assassination power built on terror and madness is never secure, no matter how absolute it may appear in the moment. As Caligula's behavior became increasingly erratic, cruel, and unpredictable, the circle of his enemies grew ever larger. These weren't just political opponents or rivals for power. These were people whose lives, dignity, or loved ones had been destroyed by the emperor's whims. People who had every reason to fear that they might be next on his list of victims. People who understood that as long as Caligula lived, no one in Rome was truly safe. The transformation from beloved young emperor to universally feared tyrant had been remarkably swiftless then for years. But in that short time, Caligula had managed to alienate virtually every important group in Roman society. The Senate, which had initially welcomed him with such enthusiasm, had been systematically humiliated and terrorized. Senators had watched their colleagues executed on false charges, had been forced to endure public humiliation, and had seen their ancient institution reduced to a rubber stamp for whatever mad decree the emperor might issue on any given day. Their fear was mixed with rage, but openly opposing an emperor who controlled the military and had shown no hesitation about using violence was suicide. The wealthy aristocracy of Rome had their own grievances. Many had seen their property confiscated through false treason charges, their family members executed or exiled, their dignity stripped away at the emperor's pleasure. The constant financial demands, the expectation that they would fund the emperor's extravagant projects and parties, had drained many family fortunes. They lived in constant anxiety, knowing that displaying too much wealth might attract the emperor's attention and lead to confiscation. But displaying too little might offend him and lead to accusations of disloyalty. Even the common people of Rome, who had loved Caligula at first, had grown disillusioned. The games and spectacles continued, but they couldn't completely distract from the atmosphere of fear that had settled over the city. The arbitrary executions, the blasphemous claims of divinity, the bizarre public behavior, all of this was impossible to ignore. And as Caligula's spending depleted the treasury that Tiberius had carefully built up, there were practical consequences. Infrastructure projects stalled. The grain supply became less reliable. Taxes increased to fund the emperor's excesses. The initial promise of Caligula's reign had curdled into bitter disappointment, but perhaps most dangerous of all for any Roman emperor, Caligula had lost the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor's person. These men had unique access to the imperial palace and to the emperor himself. They were supposed to be absolutely loyal, their entire purpose and identity bound up with protecting Rome's ruler. But Caligula's treatment of them had been erratic and disrespectful. He had executed some of their number on suspicion of disloyalty. He had mocked their commander, Cassius Chaerea, for being effeminate, forcing him to use humiliating passwords and subjecting him to public ridicule. This was a catastrophic mistake. A man who commanded, trained, armed soldiers, and who had daily access to the emperor was not someone who should be humiliated and antagonized. By late 40 CE and into early 41 CE, Conspiracies against Caligula were brewing throughout Rome. The question was not whether someone would try to kill him, but rather when, how, and who would be brave or desperate enough to make the first move. The challenge was significant. Killing an emperor was not like assassinating an ordinary person. He was surrounded by guards, his movements were unpredictable, and the penalty for failure was not just death but torture and the destruction of one's entire family. Any conspiracy had to be carefully planned, had to involve people who could get close to the emperor, and had to move quickly enough that the emperor's notorious paranoia didn't detect it before it could be executed. The conspiracy that would ultimately succeed coalesced around Cassius Chaerea, the Praetorian tribune who had endured so much humiliation from Caligula. Chaerea was joined by other officers of the Praetorian Guard, men who had their own grievances against the emperor, or who simply recognized that Caligula's continued rule was unsustainable and dangerous for Rome. The conspiracy also included senators and other officials, people who stood to benefit from a change in leadership or who genuinely believed they were acting to save Rome from a tyrant. The plotters waited for their opportunity, knowing that they would likely only get one chance. The moment came on January 24th, 41 CE, during the Palatine Games, a religious festival involving theatrical performances and celebrations. Caligula was attending the games in his palace complex on the Palatine Hill. According to historical accounts, he was in an unusually good mood that day, enjoying the performances and apparently feeling secure. Perhaps his paranoia had temporarily abated, or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that his guards, the men whose entire purpose was protecting him, would turn against him after the performances concluded. And as Caligula was walking through a narrow underground corridor beneath the palace, moving from one part of the complex to another, the assassins struck. The corridor was somewhat isolated, away from the main crowds, with limited visibility, perfect location for an ambush. The details of what happened next are recorded by ancient historians, though with some variation in the specifics. As Caligula entered the corridor, accompanied by only a few attendants rather than his full guard detail, a group of Praetorian officers surrounded him. Cassius Chaerea was reportedly the first to strike, using his sword to wound the emperor. Caligula, suddenly realizing what was happening, cried out and tried to defend himself or escape, but he was trapped. Other conspirators joined in, their swords drawn. The man who had claimed to be a god, who had demanded worship from millions, who had held the power of life and death over every person in the empire, fell to the ground bleeding. According to the historical accounts, he pleaded for his life in those final moments. This proud emperor, who had shown no mercy to others, now begged for mercy himself. He gasped for air, his wounds making it difficult to breathe. Perhaps tried to speak or call for help, but the corridor that had made the peekaboo assassination possible also ensured that no help would arrive in time. The assassins continued their attack with brutal efficiency. When their work was done, Caligula had been stabbed more than 30 times. His body was left lying in the corridor in a pool of his own blood. A stark and inglorious end for a man who had claimed divine status. The emperor, who had fancied himself Jupiter incarnate, died like any mortal, helpless against determined men with weapons. But the conspirators were not finished. They knew that as long as any of Caligula's immediate family lived, there was a risk that his supporters might rally around them and seek revenge. Caligula's wife Caesonia and his young daughter Julia Drusilla, who was only about a year old, were in the palace. In the bloody logic of Roman power politics, they were loose ends that needed to be eliminated. Soldiers were sent to find them. Caesonia was killed shortly after her husband, murdered in their private quarters. Then, in perhaps the most chilling act of that bloody day, the soldiers found Caligula's infant daughter, a baby who had done nothing, who had no understanding of politics or power, who was guilty of nothing except being the daughter of a hated emperor, was murdered according to some accounts by having her head smashed against a wall. It was a crime that shocked even Romans accustomed to political violence. But it was driven by practical considerations. No heir could be allowed to survive who might one day seek revenge, or around whom opposition might coalesce. Thus ended the reign of Caligula. The entire imperial family had been wiped out in a matter of hours. The emperor who had terrorized Rome for nearly 4 years was dead, his body lying in an underground corridor, his blood soaking into the floor. His divine pretensions exposed as the delusions they had always been. The little boy who had once charmed soldiers with his miniature boots, who had survived the destruction of his family under Tiberius, who had briefly seemed to embody Rome's hopes for a better future, had died at the age of only 28, murdered by the very men who were supposed to protect him, leaving behind a legacy not of greatness but of madness, cruelty, and wasted potential. Legacy and historical questions, 5,000 words, even after his death. Rome struggled to understand what had happened. How had a reign that began with such promise descended so rapidly into madness and tyranny? What had gone wrong with the young man who had seemed to embody Rome's hopes? These questions, first asked in the immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination, have echoed through the centuries and remain subjects of debate among historians, psychologists, and scholars even today. The search for answers has taken us through medical records, psychological theories, political analyses, and philosophical inquiries. Yet Caligula remains one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures. In the immediate aftermath of his death, there was chaos. The Praetorian Guard, having just murdered the emperor they were sworn to protect, suddenly realized they had created a power vacuum with potentially catastrophic consequences. Rome without an emperor was vulnerable to civil war, military coups, and political collapse. The conspirators had focused so intently on killing Caligula that they hadn't fully planned what would come next. Different factions within the Guard and the Senate had different ideas about who should rule, and for several tense hours, it seemed Rome might descend into the kind of violent power struggle that had plagued the late Republic. Claudius Caligula's uncle had been found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified that the assassins would kill all members of the imperial family. Claudius had spent his life being dismissed and ridiculed. He had a limp, a stammer, and was generally considered incompetent by Rome's elite. But the Praetorian Guard saw in him a perfect compromise. He had the imperial bloodline that gave legitimacy, but he seemed weak enough to be controllable. They proclaimed him emperor, essentially forcing the Senate to accept their choice. It was a pivotal moment in Roman history, demonstrating that the Praetorian Guard, not the Senate or the people, now held the real power to make and unmake emperors. Claudius would go on to prove far more capable than anyone expected. But his elevation set a dangerous precedent. The military had learned that emperors were not divinely ordained or politically untouchable. They could be killed and replaced if they displeased the wrong people. This lesson would haunt Rome for centuries, as successive emperors fell victim to conspiracies, many of them involving the Praetorian Guard in a very real sense. Caligula's assassination marked the moment when Rome's emperors lost any pretense of being above the military and became instead dependent upon military support for their very survival. But what of Caligula himself? What had gone wrong? The ancient sources offer various explanations, but we must approach them with caution. The primary accounts of Caligula's reign were written by historians who lived during or shortly after his time: Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Philo of Alexandria, and Josephus. None of these writers had any reason to speak kindly of Caligula. He was a condemned tyrant whose memory had been officially damned by the Sonetta process called damnatio memoria, where his name was to be erased from public monuments and his achievements forgotten. Writing positive things about a damned emperor could be politically dangerous and would certainly earn no favor with subsequent rulers. Moreover, ancient Roman historians had a tendency toward exaggeration and moral storytelling. They weren't trying to be objective in the modern sense. They were trying to teach lessons about virtue and vice, about the corrupting influence of power, about divine justice. When they wrote about emperors they considered tyrants, they amplified the worst aspects, added scandalous details that may or may not have been true, and constructed narratives that fit their moral purposes. This means that some of the most outrageous stories about Caligula, the incest, the most extreme cruelties, some of the bizarre behaviors, might be exaggerations or even complete inventions, designed to demonstrate just how evil he was. That said, there's enough consistency across multiple independent sources to conclude that Caligula's reign was genuinely problematic and that his behavior was genuinely erratic and cruel. The question is not whether he was a troubled ruler, but rather what caused his troubles and how extreme they really were. The medical explanation has been popular since ancient times. The severe illness Caligula suffered within his first year as emperor is mentioned by multiple sources, and something clearly happened to change his behavior. Modern medical historians have proposed various diagnoses. Temporal lobe epilepsy is one possibility. This condition can cause personality changes, religious or grandiose delusions, hypergraphia, excessive writing, and sudden violent outbursts. All of these symptoms could align with what we know of Caligula's behavior: his claim to divinity, his apparent compulsive need to build and create spectacles. His unpredictable violence. Encephalitis is another possibility. This inflammation of the brain, often caused by viral infections, can result in dramatic personality changes, impaired judgment, emotional instability, and cognitive impairment. If Caligula's illness was a severe case of encephalitis, it could have damaged specific regions of his brain responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and reality testing. The fact that his personality seemed to change after the illness supports this theory. He was one person before falling ill and a different person afterward. Some researchers have even speculated about hyperthyroidism, which can cause irritability, anxiety, emotional volatility, and impaired judgment. Others have suggested that he might have suffered from a brain tumor, particularly in the frontal lobe, which could explain the personality changes and increasingly bizarre behavior. The problem with all these medical theories is that we can never know for certain. We don't have Caligula's body to examine, no medical records beyond vague, ancient descriptions, no way to conduct the kind of diagnostic tests that might confirm or rule out these conditions. There's also the possibility of poisoning, though whether as an assassination attempt during his illness or as an explanation for his changed behavior afterward. Rome was notorious for political poisonings, and many of the substances used various plant toxins. Heavy metals like lead or mercury could cause neurological damage that might explain personality changes. Lead poisoning, in particular, was common in ancient Rome due to lead water pipes and lead-sweetened wine. While not specific to Caligula, chronic lead exposure could have contributed to mental instability, though probably not enough to explain the dramatic transformation on its own. But medical explanations alone feel incomplete. They don't account for the specific ways Caligula's madness manifested the particular targets of his cruelty, the symbolic nature of some of his actions, the political sophistication that sometimes appeared alongside the apparent insanity. This is where psychological explanations become important. Caligula's childhood trauma was extraordinary, even by the brutal standards of Roman imperial politics. He watched his father die under mysterious circumstances. He witnessed his mother and brothers being persecuted, exiled, and ultimately killed. He spent his formative teenage years essentially as a hostage on Capri, having to constantly perform and hide his true feelings to survive, under the watchful eye of a paranoid emperor who had destroyed his family. Modern psychology recognizes that this kind of severe, prolonged childhood trauma can have profound effects on personality development and adult behavior. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one framework for understanding Caligula's behavior. People with PTSD, especially when the trauma occurs during critical developmental periods, can experience emotional numbing, difficulty trusting others, hypervigilance about threats, and sometimes inappropriate or excessive anger. Complex PTSD, which develops from sustained trauma over time rather than a single event, can additionally involve difficulties with emotional regulation, negative self-perception, alternating with grandiose compensation, and disturbed relationships with others. Many of Caligula's documented behaviors, his paranoia, his sudden, violent rages, his difficulty maintaining normal relationships, his need to feel powerful and in control, could be understood as trauma responses. There's also the question of attachment disorders. Caligula's primary attachment figures, his parents, were taken from him traumatically. His father died when he was young, and his mother was first separated from him by exile, and then died while he was still a child. He had no stable, secure adult figures to provide the consistent care and affection necessary for healthy emotional development. Children who experience such disrupted attachments often struggle as adults with trust, intimacy, empathy, and emotional stability. They may develop what psychologists call reactive attachment disorder, or, in more severe cases, patterns of behavior that resemble personality disorders. Some modern psychologists who have analyzed historical accounts of Caligula have suggested that he may have met criteria for what we would now call narcissistic personality disorder, or even antisocial personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder involves grandiosity, which certainly fits Caligula's self-deification, need for admiration, sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, and tendency to exploit others. Antisocial personality disorder involves disregard for others' rights, lack of remorse, deceitfulness, impulsivity, and aggression. Caligula's behavior as emperor, the cruelty without apparent guilt, the manipulation, the impulsive decisions, the violence could fit these diagnoses. However, we must be extremely cautious about diagnosing historical figures, especially from fragmentary and biased sources. Mental health diagnoses are meant for living people who can be interviewed, observed, and tested. Applying them to someone who died 2,000 years ago based on accounts written by his enemies is methodologically problematic. These frameworks might help us understand patterns in his behavior, but they can't give us definitive answers about his mental state. Among certain historians and political theorists, that Caligula was not mad at all, at least not in the sense of being disconnected from reality or unable to control his behavior. Instead, they argue he was engaged in a kind of deliberate political theater, systematically challenging and exposing the hypocrisies and contradictions of the Roman political system. Consider this perspective. Rome had transitioned from a republic where power was theoretically distributed among various institutions to an empire where one man held supreme authority. But the Romans, deeply attached to their republican traditions, maintained elaborate fictions about this arrangement. The Senate still existed and pretended to have power. Emperors pretended to be merely first citizens rather than absolute monarchs. Everyone engaged in a kind of political theater where they acted as if Rome was still fundamentally republican, while actually living under autocratic rule. From this perspective, Caligula's actions can be seen as deliberate provocations designed to expose these fictions. By declaring himself a god, he was revealing what emperors actually were in the new system: beings with absolute power, who were accountable to no one. By threatening to make his horse a consul, he was demonstrating that the consulship had become meaningless, that the Senate's prestigious offices were now just empty honors to be dispensed at the emperor's whim. By his extreme cruelty and unpredictability, he was showing that in a system where one person held all power, there were no real constraints on what that person could do. This interpretation sees Caligula as a kind of dark satirist or political philosopher, using his reign to conduct an experiment in exposing the nature of absolute power. Some scholars point to his apparent intelligence and education. He was well-read, clever, capable of sophisticated political maneuvering when he chose to be. Would such a person really descend into random madness, or might his apparently mad actions have been calculated gestures with symbolic meaning? The problem with this theory is that it requires us to believe Caligula was willing to make himself hated, risk his life, and ultimately die to make a philosophical point. It also doesn't fully account for the personal cruelty, the individual victims whose suffering served no obvious symbolic or political purpose. Moreover, the fact that an action can be interpreted symbolically doesn't mean it was intended symbolically. Even genuinely mad or evil actions can be given symbolic meaning by observers looking for patterns, perhaps the truth, as is often the case with historical figures, lies not in choosing one explanation but in recognizing how multiple factors interacted. Caligula likely did suffer from some form of mental illness or neurological damage caused by his early illness. He also certainly suffered from severe childhood trauma that affected his personality and behavior, and he was operating within a political system whose contradictions and corruptions he may have understood and exploited, consciously or unconsciously. Imagine a person who has experienced profound childhood trauma, who has developed maladaptive coping mechanisms and possible personality disorders as a result, and who then suffers a serious illness that causes additional neurological damage. Now place that person in a position of absolute power, where no one can effectively say no to them, where every whim can be indulged, where consequences that would check a normal person's behavior simply don't apply. This combination damaged psychology meets absolute power could produce exactly the kind of behavior we see in Caligula's reign. The absolute power itself was part of the problem. There's a famous quote often attributed to the British historian Lord Acton: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." While Acton was writing in the 19th century, the principle applies perfectly to Caligula. When a person can do literally anything without facing real consequences, when they're surrounded by people who flatter and obey rather than challenge and correct, when there are no systems or institutions with the power to check their impulses, even a mentally healthy person might begin to lose perspective on what's reasonable or moral. For Caligula, who may have already been dealing with mental health issues and trauma, this lack of constraints was catastrophic. Every impulse, no matter how cruel or bizarre, could be enacted. Every paranoid fear could be acted upon. Every grandiose delusion could be realized. The very fact that people feared him and obeyed him might have confirmed his delusions of godhood after all. Don't people fear and obey gods? The system had no mechanisms for dealing with an emperor who was unfit to rule, no way to remove someone who was clearly causing harm, no checks or balances that could constrain his behavior without resorting to assassination. This systemic problem plagued Rome throughout its imperial period. Good emperors, moderate, capable men like Augustus or Marcus Aurelius could make the system work reasonably well. But bad emperors, mad, cruel, incompetent, or all three could cause catastrophic harm, and there was no constitutional or institutional way to remove them short of murder. The Senate had no real power to check an emperor who controlled the military. The people could riot but couldn't remove a ruler. The military could assassinate an emperor but had no legitimate mechanism for doing so and no clear way to choose a replacement. Caligula's reign and assassination thus exposed fundamental weaknesses in Rome's political structure. The empire was only as stable as the current emperor's character and mental health, a deeply problematic basis for governance. Later, Roman thinkers and rulers grappled with this problem, attempting various solutions: adoption of capable successors, shared rule between multiple emperors, increased power for the military or Senate, but no one ever fully solved the challenge. The instability this created contributed significantly to Rome's eventual decline and fall, beyond the political and systemic implications. Caligula's story had a profound cultural impact that extended far beyond ancient Rome. his name became proverbial, a byword for tyranny, madness, and the corruption of power. In subsequent centuries, whenever a ruler displayed cruelty, irrationality, or megalomaniacal tendencies, they were compared to Caligula. The comparison became a powerful rhetorical weapon. Calling someone another Caligula was a devastating accusation that immediately evoked an entire complex of negative associations. Writers and artists throughout history have been fascinated by Caligula as a subject. In the ancient world, Suetonius's biography of Caligula in the 12 Caesars became one of the most widely read and influential accounts, shaping how subsequent generations understood him. Medieval and Renaissance scholars, rediscovering classical texts, found in Caligula a perfect example for their moral and political treatises about the dangers of absolutism and the importance of virtue in rulers. In the modern era, Caligula has appeared in countless works of literature, drama, and film. Albert Camus wrote a play called Caligula, first performed in 1945, that used the Roman emperor as a vehicle for exploring existentialist themes about meaning, absurdity, and freedom. In Camus' version, Caligula's madness is actually a kind of radical honesty about the meaninglessness of existence and an attempt to live in absolute freedom, unbound by conventional morality. It's a philosophical interpretation that has little to do with historical accuracy, but shows how Caligula has become a canvas onto which different eras project their own concerns and questions. The 1979 film, Caligula, produced by Penthouse magazine, founder Bob Gucsoni, and written by Gore Vidal, presented an extremely graphic and controversial portrayal that mixed historical drama with explicit sexual content. While heavily criticized for its sensationalism and historical liberties, the film demonstrated that Caligula retained his power to shock and fascinate even in the sexually liberated late 20th century. More recent treatments in television series, like I, Claudius, and various documentaries, have attempted more historically grounded portrayals, though they still inevitably engage with the question of Caligula's madness and the reasons for it.